To discuss how the government can curb illicit cash flow along the border points is Kwame Owino, the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs of Kenya. He's also a policy analyst who has dealt with illicit cash flow along the South Sudan border widely. Thank you for joining us. He is in our INM studios. So let's get right into it, Kwame. Thank you. Now, about the elites who are looting South Sudan dry and are living large in Kenya and other neighboring countries. Yet South Sudanese are being riddled by years of war and destitute poverty. Is this something that we as Kenya, as a country, should actually look into?
Obviously, we should. And we should be concerned for the reason that, one, some of the main protagonists in that conflict in South Sudan have properties, have members of their families, and they have assets in Kenya. For that reason, we should be especially cautious that some of these assets were not acquired using money that was illicitly, or rather was gained illegally from South Sudan, whether by theft or extortion or whichever other way. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that we, as a major player in East and Central Africa, and the East African Community region, have a huge role to keep the area at peace. For that reason, obligations that we have, and it's also in our own interest nationally, both for Kenya, Uganda, and even Tanzania, for South Sudan to come to peace as quickly as is possible. I think part of the intransigence that is seen in the protagonists in South Sudan comes from the fact that they have the opportunity and the options to actually live outside the country while continuing to foment trouble. There also is evidence that they are using some institutions in Kenya, specifically financial institutions, whether knowingly or unknowingly, are actually facilitating flow of cash, especially money that comes from oil, natural resources, and then are diverted into Kenya, which means those risks flow to us. But we have strong money laundering laws and laws that require us to be particularly cautious regarding people, politically exposed persons. So those three reasons mean that we actually have an imperative to act.
As we speak about the money laundering laws which are inexistent, we cannot fail to note the position of trust that Kenya and others of our neighbors have actually taken with the South Sudan government officials and who have seized opportunity to loot the country dry. Is this something we should revisit, the position of trust that Kenya has given various South Sudan government officials?
Yes, it is. I mean, and not just that. It's because we have legal obligations, and our legal obligations are not only coming from the Kenyan law against money laundering. Our legal obligations also come from international regulations, international laws, and some of these people have been tagged or mentioned. For that reason, it's an obligation that Kenya bears to actually call them to account and to ask them to stop using Kenya as a springboard, possibly for fomenting trouble, but more importantly, just to stop using institutions within Kenya, institutions and their financial infrastructure in Kenya, to loot funds and try to divert it through the country or clean it up by buying assets in Kenya, Uganda, and possibly in other parts of Eastern Africa. So yes, definitely it requires us to obey our own laws as Kenya, but also to obey the laws according to international treaties that we are parties to.
Okay, even as we pick up on that, now a US-based investigative project called the Sentry actually noted that around 22.6 billion Kenya shillings in revenues was actually been diverged to the Padang Dinka White Army militia, which has been blamed by the United Nations of all sorts of crimes, mass murder, rape, and targeted destruction of property, you name it. Is this perhaps a reason why the unending war in South Sudan never seems to come to an end? You know, even with peace agreements, with the recent one, we know there's a recent peace agreement which seems to be bearing fruits. But we also have to bear in mind that there have been a couple of them. Is this money laundering also linked to the unending war that is facing the youngest nation in the world?
The report that you've referred to, yes, made the linkage between money from South Sudan into private pockets, but also this money coming back to finance the war. Given that link, it is clear to us that some people have a financial incentive, or at least extract some value from continuing war, because they use the possibility of buying arms and they use that possibility of buying arms to actually continue to press claims and at the same time to continue to oppress the people of South Sudan by committing atrocities. So yes, it comes back from a financial incentive, which goes back to politicians or people with political interest, the military, and that cycle is a dangerous one for the region. So whether we have a financial interest, an economic interest from the political interest and the interest in peace and the possibility of the backflow of arms into Kenya, it's certainly in our interest to act here.
Well, let's talk about the checks and balances. Obviously, the United Nations has placed sanctions on various individuals, among them persons of interest in especially this grand looting from South Sudan. Is this enough, even as the sanctions are placed, these individuals continue roaming freely in Kenya? Is this enough to actually make sure the checks and balances are in place?
Well, if the United Nations has called out specific people and actually placed them as persons of interest, as I said earlier, we have obligations as a country to actually, provided the legal infrastructure is in place, or rather provided the legal instruments are in place, then we need to call these people into account and actually ask them to bear responsibility. Because if we fail to do that, we too would suffer the possibility of being complicit in the crimes that they continue to commit, whether it's the political crimes, whether it's the economic ones, or even the atrocities that are taking place during war.
Okay, as we conclude, Kwame, perhaps on the illegal flow of cash, not only from South Sudan to Kenya and the neighboring countries all around the continent, what do you think is the best way to actually deal with this?
Well, there is no single silver bullet that will solve the problem. But I think coordination among countries, because it is clear that, as you can see, there's cross-border crime in the sense that some people from South Sudan, not exclusively, but in this case, are stealing public money and diverting it through Uganda, through Kenya, and possibly through other countries, and then onward to other places. So definitely coordination among authorities is required. And that means that, say, for instance, central banks, like in our case, the central bank and associations of bankers have to be especially vigilant to the fact that there are these people who are going to do that. And a reporting mechanism, we have a financial reporting center as well. So all these things bring us back to the fact that the laws that are in place, and we have laws. Kenya doesn't have a problem with this in terms of the absence of law. What we need to ask ourselves, what's the central bank doing, what's our Ministry of Foreign Affairs doing, and what is Parliament doing to ensure that the laws that have been passed are completely implemented.
Well, thank you, Kwame Owino. Obviously answering that question, not just in regards to South Sudan, but also in regards to other African countries, which this particular trend has been noticed. Talk about Congo, talk about Somalia, especially the charcoal industry in that particular country. That was Kwame Owino, the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and was actually delving deeper into that particular story where elite are reportedly looting South Sudan and to leave large in Nairobi. Sanctions have been placed on these particular individuals, but they still continue roaming freely and getting millions from that particular country, which some of that particular amount is rechanneled to army militia and perhaps also continue to contribute to the mass murder, rape and targeted destruction of property happening in South Sudan. Thank you for your input. We'll now take a short break right here.